Hi all. So this week we're going to talk briefly again about the section on harm, and then we will set up for next week. And next week we're going to particularly look at mass incarceration. So in terms of the readings, the first reading, the one on Native Americans, you guys picked up really well on like the injustice of it, right? But I think that the one thing that we should make sure not to forget in terms of the article is how this relates to criminology. And to get us kind of thinking about that, there's a quote on page 114. I'm just going to read this paragraph. So, American Indians are exposed to a variety of social, economic, and environmental injustices. They are among the poorest populations in the United States, suffer from hypersegregation, live in inadequate housing, lack access to education and life resources other groups take for granted, have a higher incidence of a number of diseases, lack access to adequate medical screening and treatment, and have experienced a long historical process of reduced native land holdings to a fraction of their original size. Taken together, these conditions of life have a strong impact on the average life course of Native Americans. Moreover, these conditions are evidence of a structural injustice against Native populations, amounting to a long-lasting social and economic war that could be described as a long-term act of genocide. So it's not just that there's injustices. It's not just that Native Americans' lives are difficult. It's that it is a structural injustice, right? It is embedded into the system itself. So how does this relate to criminology? It relates to criminology because essentially what we see on Indian reservations is governmental and economic actors slowly killing off Native Americans simply because their existence is an inconvenience. That's it, right? And so the question they want to ask is so if we accept the sort of face value definition of what crime is, right, and then ergo what justice is, right, if the official definition given by the state of what justice is correct, then in essence we have to essentially feel like the slow genocide of Native peoples is itself just. And the same thing with the treatment of African Americans, the ghettoization. We're going to look a lot at that in our mass incarceration section, the way in which our criminal justice system is sort of this continuation of slavery. But looking specifically at Native Americans in this case, what we're saying is that if you accept that definition of justice, right, if the definition of justice is legality, that means that all kinds of things which are horrible, right, are just. So a lot of critical criminologists want to say that this is not a feasible definition of justice, that we have to define it differently. And so that's what the article's pointing to. So it's not just that there's these sort of like things that happen and it's bad, that's true, but the implications of that are larger for us as criminology students. The ramification of that is that it really calls into question the definition that the vast majority of criminologists carry around with them. And that's because the reservation itself is defined by law. It was constructed by law, right? Initially with treaties, and then slowly becomes redefined by laws to support certain forms of resource extraction. There was just an article not that long, this was like a week ago, talking about, and it links up nicely with our article, talking about the effect on Native American, on Indian reservations of the COVID-19 crisis. that a lot of Native Americans are specifically a danger because the cancer rates, because of, like we were reading, right, the sheer amount of environmental degradation that surrounds them, right? You're talking about people who are regularly exposed to radioactive materials. So like the ability of their immune system to fight things off is not nearly as good as other populations. So we're going to see a far higher percentage on Native American reservations, right? Where did this environmental harm come from, right? It came from the redefining of native treaties from the federal government to allow companies to come in and extract uranium in the case of the Navajo. Or I spent a month on an Indian reservation in New Mexico, the Wind River Reservation, the Apache Reservation. And you saw the same sort of things, that they had redefined the laws so that quite literally owning property was not possible. And the reason why they did that is they were extracting iron ore off of the land, right? So when it talks about reducing native holdings, that's what they're talking about, right? And getting back to the ideas, the central idea is that that is fine if you accept the legal definition of right and wrong. Because in essence, the government, the federal government and corporate actors have been capable of redefining. This is very similar to some of the stuff when we talked about white-collar crime, right? They're capable of redefining the law. So that essentially anything that they do is not a criminal act, including, in this case, quite literally sort of slow genocide. And I mean that when Indian reservations were formulated, that was the government policy on it, and it still exists today, largely in the same mold. The federal government thought if they just simply cordoned off Native Americans, put them on poor lands, that they would eventually just die, and then they wouldn't be a problem, and they wouldn't have to deal with them, right? So like you're quite literally talking about a legal genocide. And in fact, like when we get into our mass incarceration stuff this week, you'll see a very similar story for African Americans. We exist very much so in a system of apartheid when it comes to African Americans. We sort of this colonial policy of cordoning people off, keeping them separate, right, etc., etc. So really that's the meat of the article, right? That our law creates the system. There's a great legal scholar by the name of Giorgio Agamben, and he talks a lot about that we're becoming increasingly, certain populations at the very least are increasingly becoming reduced to what he calls bare life, right? That the government is capable of essentially declaring whether people have a life that's worth living or not, and then removing life from them in one way or another. And you see that very much so in populations like Native Americans, right? Native Americans have been reduced to bare life, simply to existing, and the government has a the possibility of turning them into a population which can, and this is how he would like to phrase it, that can be killed but not sacrificed, right? They don't die for a cause, but they can be killed in the name of essentially nothing, right? There's open game in killing them. And so that's what we're seeing, right? And so if that exists, like if that's fine, and we're okay with that, right? Like, is that something we're willing to live with? Or do we really need to like sort of rethink our definitions? Okay, getting into the restorative justice article. You guys did a great job looking at that as well. One thing I want to bring out is that the idea behind restorative justice, it's not just sort of like oh, this is a good idea. Instead, the underlying assumption of it is that we exist in a system that's broken, right? So between the two articles, there's a very similar way of thinking about the legal system, that this sort of system of individual punishment, right, is a broken system. It's a broken way of understanding the law, it's a broken way of dealing with criminal behavior, and it's a broken way of understanding what's right and wrong. And so this gets brought out instead in this tension between, often pursuing individual criminality individual enforcement and punishment, to the detriment of the community and often the injury of the victims themselves. And so you see, like, where most policing occurs, right, in these sort of crime-dense neighborhoods, essentially you have this sort of crimiogenic system coming out of the law, that by destroying communities, pulling good chunks of the population out into the carceral system, back into the ghetto, you're essentially creating, right, a system that's extremely harmful, especially considering the things, I mean, this has been a kind of a reoccurring theme, the things that most people get arrested and incarcerated for are very minor crimes. It's not murder, it's not rape, it's not, even aggravated assault, right? Most of the things that people are getting arrested for are minor property crimes or, drug crimes or things like that. So you're quite literally talking about, in some ways, sort of destroying communities simply to punish, right, a fairly small infraction. So the restorative justice movement is essentially, why don't we do something else with those small infractions? Why don't we rethink how we think about justice and how we implement it? So that is just getting us to think about that. Okay, so for next week, I want you guys looking specifically, I want you guys to pay attention to the histories in both articles. We're going to get two different histories of the place of the penal system, right? The place of the system of mass incarceration. One is within this sort of like long history of slavery, and the other is this sort of nice long history of what prisons are like. So pay attention in both of those to the histories, how we're seeing changes and how what we live in now is different from what existed in the past, right? Or similar. So like in both cases, or in the case of Waquant, that's the Deadly Symbiosis article, I want you guys particularly to think about like the history of race in America and the place of mass incarceration. And what is it doing? And how is what is it doing similar to the other systems? So, or other periods. So that's kind of your assignment for this week. Otherwise, have a great week, and I'll see you soon. Bye.